I wrote this paper like about, was it a year and a half ago or so? I wrote it specifically to do a presentation for the Vallejo Yacht Club. However, that never materialized, so this sat around, and I finally said that to myself that this might be pretty good for docent enrichment. So you people will be the first ones to hear it. The water around him beckoned Jack London at an early age. Growing up mostly in Oakland, California, Jack London always had San Francisco Bay close by. This provided him the opportunity to experience adventures on the bay that inevitably led to adventures in far-out waters. The main source for Jack London's early experiences in sailing is found in his writing. The book John Barleycorn is the main source. Here he mentions sailing a skiff on the bay at age 14. The skiff was a large rowboat with a centerboard and a small sail. I found this sketch as a representative of a skiff. Actually, the definition of a skiff is kind of general. It's just a small boat. London observed ships from foreign countries which triggered a yearning to experience the adventures he envisioned were to be found in other parts of the world. The first sailing boat that Jack London owned was the Razzle Dazzle. Jack London's sailing adventures on the Razzle Dazzle, a sloop, was his experiences as an oyster pirate. He paid French Frank, another oyster pirate, $300 that he had borrowed from his wet nurse, Virginia Prentice. And with his own vessel, London now felt tremendously free and wasted no time in raiding the oyster beds with his one-man crew, Spider Healy. The oyster beds were on government land that had been taken over by the Southern Pacific Railroad and leased to oyster growers. London sailed the Razzle Dazzle until the mainsail burned. Then he teamed up with young Scratch Nelson on his boat and continued as an oyster pirate. Eventually, London realized it was only a matter of time before he would either be caught or killed. So he agreed to become a deputy for the Fish Patrol. This may have been very unofficial in regards to being a deputy, since there was nothing in the records anywhere that was ever found that he was part of the Fish Patrol. So it could very well be that he knew this one person who headed the Fish Patrol in Benicia and made an agreement with him that he would get back half of the money for any fines that were paid of any of the people that he caught breaking the law on the bay. So the Fish Patrol was operating out of Benicia. And as some of you know, the Fish Patrol went on to be renamed the Fish and Game. It was during this period of his life that he had a near-death adventure. In John Barleycorn, Jack London describes this experience. After a night of drinking, he stumbles off the sloop and falls into Carquinez Straits waters and is borne away by the heavy current. In his drunken conditions, he imagines drifting off to die in the water. With time and the cold of the water, he starts to sober up and feels a strong desire to live. He tries to swim to shore, but finds himself too weak to fight the current. As he feels the end is near, a Greek fisherman rescues him, thus allowing him the rest of his life. Many Fish Patrol adventures, true or not, can be found in Jack London's book, The Tales of the Fish Patrol, as well as in John Barleycorn. At the age of 17, Jack London had his first ocean sailing adventure. He signed on to the Sophia Sutherland, a 3-masted sealing schooner, on a voyage to the coast of Japan. Here he had to hold his own with older, experienced sailors. Initially, he was tested by some of the men, but eventually won their respect. The Sophia Sutherland took 51 days to reach Japan's Bonin Islands, where the ship was prepared for its work in the Bering Sea. During a voyage, during the voyage, a violent typhoon was encountered off the coast of Japan. Jack successfully took his turn at the wheel in the middle of the typhoon. Later, on returning home, he wrote an essay of his experiences as an entry in a writing contest for the San Francisco Morning Call. He was awarded $25 for winning first place. Second and third places were won by students from Stanford and UC Berkeley. This represented quite an accomplishment for a high school student in competition with college students. In 1903, Jack London bought an old but fast sloop, the Spray. In 1903, February 25th, the Saturday Evening Post was sending $750 to Jack London for the serial version of The Call of the Wild, and in serial version for the magazine, they dropped "the" from the title and called it Call of the Wild. That was February 25th. And then on March 10th, a little while later, he bought the Spray. So obviously, he had some ready money. And then on March 25th, he accepts $2,000 for the Call of the Wild book rights, so that he was giving up his royalty rights and was very happy to do it for the $2,000. The Spray was used for cruises on San Francisco Bay, the Sacramento Delta, and the Petaluma River. Records show cruises from Oakland that include trips to Stockton, Black Point, and through the Delta. Jack London spent much time on the Spray through the end of 1903. This allowed him quiet time, not only to write, but to contemplate leaving his marriage. Recall, he had married in 1900 for the wrong reasons, as he and his wife did not tell each other that they loved each other, but were very fond of each other. The Spray was kind of like an escape, and he had the money for it, and he went for it and enjoyed getting away. There followed many events in Jack London's life that prevented him from doing much sailing for a while. This included, of course, the breakup of his first marriage, the Russian-Japanese War, a lecture tour across the country, and then the building and sailing of the Snark, a boat that was designed to have Jack and his second wife, Charmian, sail around the world. Now, here, because it's related to the Spray, I've included some information that should kind of place things in order regarding Charmian in Jack London's life. It was the summer of, the very beginning of the summer of 1903. Jack rented a tent cabin for the family to stay at Wake Robin, with Charmian's aunt, which Charmian's aunt Nanetta had just purchased. So now we have a date as to when Wake Robin was started by Nanetta. He sent Bessie ahead with the two girls while he planned to first sail on the Spray. So he was sending the family up here, and he was going to take off and sail a little bit and think about things before coming up to Wake Robin. Well, something happened. Before he could do that, a wagon in which he was riding threw a wheel, and Jack was thrown out, spraining his knee and scraping skin off of his arms and legs. Bessie had asked Charmian to do some shopping for her, so Charmian took the items to give to Jack at his house. Jack's childhood friend, Frank Atherton, was there at the house helping Jack pack, getting ready to come up to Wake Robin. Jack managed to get out of bed to talk to Charmian for about half an hour on the front porch. And then he impulsively grabbed her and kissed her. This moment changed everything. Jack went on to Wake Robin, as did Charmian. It was at Wake Robin at this time that Jack announced to Bessie that he was leaving her. So most of you probably have not seen a picture of the spray. And from there, most of you or all have seen the Snark. This is the construction. The Snark voyage from April 23rd, 1907 to December 8th, 1908 proved to be a great sea adventure for both Jack and Charmian. Jack London's desire of making a voyage around the world started with the knowledge that a Captain Slocum had accomplished this feat in 1898 in his small boat, the Spray. And I think that boat was something like 30 feet. Jack's thinking was, we can do this too. Projects of building a house, developing a ranch were put on hold when Jack found that Charmian was equally enthusiastic in undertaking such a great adventure. Jack decided on building a ketch-rigged sailboat that would be 45 feet at the waterline. A 70-horsepower engine was chosen to be used when necessary. Jack was to spare no money in achieving this enormous feat of sailing around the world. Initial construction of the Snark took place at Anderson Shipyard in San Francisco at Hunters Point. Finishing was later done in Oakland. Construction delays started with the 1906 earthquake and then continued all the way to sailing day, a date that was postponed endless times. The cost initially estimated at $7,000 finally reached $30,000. Jack finally decided to sail even though some finishing work was undone. This was later completed in Hawaii with some much needed repair work. This is a studio picture posed to show them planning their trip. On April 23rd, 1907, the Snark finally left port. The crew of the Snark consisted of Jack and Charmian London, Roscoe Ames, Bert Stoltz, Martin Johnson, and Paul Tucci. This is a picture of Jack and Charmian on the Snark in the waters in Oakland prior to the voyage. Shortly after starting the voyage, a series of problems developed on the Snark. The cook and cabin boy got seasick. Fresh fruits and vegetables were spoiled. The Snark leaked. Watertight compartments were not watertight. And ironworks broke and fell apart. In short, the Snark had been made with many substandard materials. Also, in the face of a strong wind, it was impossible to have the Snark heave to, no matter what was tried. The series of mishaps seemed to have no end. Roscoe, who Jack had chosen to be navigator, proved to be sorely deficient in navigation skills, forcing Jack to quickly learn navigation. Fortunately, wherever Jack went, he always took a lot of books. And of course, he had books on navigation on this trip. After about a week of study, Jack felt quite proficient and was very proud of his new skill. 27 days after starting the voyage, the Snark arrived at Oahu. They were expected well before that, but you can imagine the trial and error process of navigation and getting there required some constant energy and constant changing of course. 5 months were spent in the Hawaiian Islands awaiting the completion of work which needed to be done on the Snark. This period was not spent idle on the beach. The Londons visited the lepers on Molokai, explored large cattle ranches on the Big Island and Maui, rode around the slopes of Haleakala, and Jack learned to ride a surfboard. Much time was spent exploring the islands. A little side note on the surfboard, he was introduced to a man named George Freeth in Waikiki, who was proficient in surfboard riding and also surfboard making. And this man came to California shortly after Jack had met him, a few years later, and started the surfboard craze in Southern California. This is a nice picture of the Snark. Much time was spent exploring the islands. The crew changed with the leaving of Roscoe Ames, Bert Stoltz, and Paul Tochigi. There was an addition of Captain James Langhorne Warren and Yoshimatsu Nakata, who stayed with Jack till about a year and a half before Jack died. On leaving Hawaii, Jack London attempted what had been called the impossible traverse to the Marquesas Islands to begin the South Pacific adventure. The successful, difficult voyage took them to Melville's chosen home, Taipei. From the Marquesas, the Snark continued on a leisurely voyage through the many island chains, including stops in Tahiti, Bora Bora, Suva, Savaii, until it reached the Solomon Islands. It was in Tahiti that they met up with the Nature Man. Jack London had actually met Ernest Darling, the Nature Man, as he was called, in the Bay Area in San Francisco. Ran into him. He saw this man with cut-off pants, barefoot, trudging through the streets of San Francisco, and had a torn T-shirt that he was wearing on top. So Jack London was fascinated with the looks of this man, because the average man that you would see in San Francisco at that time would have been dressed with a hat, a coat, and a tie, and would look very dapper. So Ernest Darling stood out like a sore thumb, and Jack London got to know him. It turned out that Ernest Darling contracted pneumonia and had a lot of problems, health problems. He wound up in Oregon, where his father lived, and decided that after his second bout with pneumonia, what they were trying to do for him. So he took off into the wilderness in Oregon, took off his clothes, and lived like the animals lived, on berries and whatever he could forage up there. He did get meat part of the time, and he did manage to survive. But as you know, Oregon gets pretty cold come winter, so he had to head to his father's place before moving on. And everywhere he went, they literally paid him to get rid of him. They even got him to take off, and he wound up in Tahiti. There he found, he didn't have much in the way of money. He found a place that was free because nobody had a title to it. After he moved into this place and kind of built it up and had fruits and vegetables and the local wildlife around him, he was enjoying it. And then they found out that there was a title to it. Oh. So what they wound up doing was cutting off the road so he couldn't get there. So he had to hack a path and climb up a mountain in order to get to his property whenever he went out. Oh. Well, this is really digressing, but... So in the Solomon Islands, it became the beginning of the end for the voyage of the Snark. Here's a lighter moment. This is on the plantation Pendruffin on Guadalcanal, and the owner of the plantation is the man on the extreme right wearing the woman's outfit. Extreme left for you, excuse me. This, as described by Jack London and others, this man loved parties, and so he started a party that lasted 3 days. And people slept as they felt like sleeping and would just fall down someplace and go to sleep. But the other thing that happened was that Jack was given some hashish, and he tried it out and became so wild that he scared the hell out of Charmian. And not only Charmian, everybody else, because after Jack tried it, nobody else was willing to do it. Oh. So, aside from malaria and other common tropical diseases, the crew of the Snark now encountered the deadly Yaws disease, which was spread by bacteria in contact with open sores or wounds and possibly by mosquitoes. There was extremely poor sanitation on the islands, which more than likely was the main cause, the main reason for the disease spreading. And it did spread to the natives as well as the visitors. The Yaws bacteria, a direct relative of syphilis, carries with it severe consequences if not treated. The common name for the disease was Solomon sores. Jack London described it as excessively active ulcers. Quote, immediately the ulcer commences to eat. It eats in every direction, consuming skin and muscle with astounding rapidity. The pinpoint ulcer of the first day is the size of a dime by the second day, and by the end of the week, a silver dollar will not cover it. Without antibiotics, which were not yet discovered, metallic poisons were widely used at this time to treat bacterial infections. Jack London's choice for treatment was mercury chloride applied to all his open sores for the nearly 4-month period he was in the Solomon Islands. The mercury would have proceeded directly through the open sores into the bloodstream to settle mostly on the kidneys, where it would slowly do its damage for the next 8 years. It became primary in causing Jack London's kidney failure and death on November 22, 1916. It was in December of 1908 that Jack London made the decision to end the dream voyage around the world. Aside from yaws, he also had developed a double fistula in the rectum. In other words, perforations, holes. Psoriasis, which was diagnosed by the doctors in Sydney. It may not have been psoriasis. Accelerated growth of his toenails and severe inflammation of his hands that included several layers of dry scaling skin that made it impossible to grip anything. It was after an operation and treatment in Sydney, Australia, that he realized it would be impossible to continue the voyage. Charmian cried when she realized the voyage must end. On April the 8th, 1909, Jack, Charmian, and their manservant, Nakata, left Sydney for Ecuador to make their way home. Why they chose Ecuador, I have no idea, except that they just maybe wanted to continue the voyage a little bit longer instead of just heading straight home. The Snark, put up for sale, had not sold, so it was left for sale in Sydney. In 1910, Jack London found his perfect boat, the Roamer. For $175, he bought a 30-foot yawl that was 40 years old. It had a wide beam, a large cabin, and huge sails that helped make the boat very responsive. Upon acquiring the Roamer, Jack London became a member of the Vallejo Yacht Club. This was in 1910, which became the starting point for many cruises. The typical trip was first to Benicia, and then on to the Delta and up the Sacramento River. 2 Japanese servants accompanied Jack and Charmian, with one acting as cook. Yoshimatsu Nakata, who had sailed with with the Londons on the Snark from Hawaii in 1907, was also always aboard. The daily schedule would include writing for Jack and typing for Charmian every morning. Afternoons were for fishing, swimming, lounging, and playing cards. This is Jack and Charmian on the Roamer with a friend of theirs, a pianist from Australia named Laurie Smith. In Jack London's article, Small Boat Sailing, published in the Yachting Monthly, he expressed his love of sailing. This is an important quote. Quote, "And once a sailor, always a sailor. The savor of the salt never stales. The sailor never grows so old that he does not care to go back for one more wrestling bout with wind and wave. I know it of myself. I have turned rancher and lived beyond sight of the sea. Yet I can stay away from it only so long. After several months have passed, I begin to grow restless. I find myself daydreaming over incidents of the last cruise, or wondering if the striped bass are running on Wingo Slough, or eagerly reading the newspaper reports of the first northern flights of ducks. And then suddenly there is a hurried packing of suitcases and overhauling of gear and we are off to Vallejo where the Romer lies, waiting, always waiting for the skiff to come alongside, for the tightening of the fire in the galley stove, for the pulling off of gaskets, the swinging up of the mainsail, and the rat-tat-tat of the reef points, for the heaving short and the breaking out, and for the twirling of the wheel as she fills away and heads up bay or down. Just to give you a quick rundown on some of the Romer cruises, these are the dates of the main cruises. In 1910, October 17th to November the 6th. 1911, April the 12th to May 7th. 1912, November 23rd to December 23rd. 1913, October 19th to January the 7th, 1914.
Wow.
In 1914 to 15, there was December 23rd to January 29th. A lot of you have seen this picture. This happened on one of those Romer cruises just before Christmas in 1914. They ran into this guy that immediately recognized Jack London because it was French Frank, the man he had bought the Razzle Dazzle from. And French Frank was actually making a living by taking care of the blinds that were set up for duck hunting. And what may have been the last time Jack, Charmian, and Nakata took the Romer on a cruise during the first weeks of 1915 as a temporary relief from stress. The Romer was the last sailboat Jack London would own. There would be no more relaxing cruises up the Delta and the Sacramento River. This floating sanctuary had been his salvation from the problems and stresses he endured while on land. On the water, he was a free man, enjoying the life of a sailor, which he had begun in boyhood. It was this love of life of a sailor that made him choose the title, Sailor on Horseback, for a future autobiography which he would never write. Well, we all know who wrote it. This is a Romer on very still waters, and I wanted to show you a contrast picture just to let you feel the energy. On November 22nd, 1916, Jack London died of kidney failure in the cottage of his beloved Beauty Ranch, where he had become a true sailor on horseback. And to give you a list of sources, these were the main ones. Russ Kingman, A Definitive Chronology. Jack London, The Cruise of the Snark, and Charmian London's The Log of the Snark. Russ Kingman's pictorial biography of Jack London. The Yachting Monthly. This one I had to read at the Huntington Library with his article, Small Boat Sailing. Andrew Sinclair, Jack, a biography of Jack London, which was published in 1977. And, of course, Earl Labor, Jack London, An American Life, published in October 2013, excuse me. I went back to Jack London. Yeah. Okay, well, that's the extent of the presentation. It's a little shorter than what I usually have done for docent enrichment because its intent was not first for the docents. It was for the time limits that I was going to have somewhere else. So I did a little bit of expansion, but not too much in order to give you a little extra information. The question is, do we know what happened to the Romer? And I don't know the full story. I know that it was sold, and then they lost track of where it went. Now, we do know that the Snark eventually was sold in Sydney, and unfortunately, it was used for the workers' trade. In other words, getting men to work at the copra plantations, and by means of near Shanghai or whatever. So the Snark went on to defy Jack London's thoughts about mankind. Yes?
Roscoe, was he Charman's uncle?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And he was fired.
He was,
Incompetent.
yeah, he was married, he got married to Ninetta, Charman's aunt.
Oh, okay.
And then after that, they split up. And she married the partner that they had when they bought Wake Robin. The question was, what happened to the property Wake Robin? And is it still there? Yeah, the building is still there, and the information I get, this is not even secondhand, maybe second or third hand, is that the person that owns it is taking very good care of it and has restored it as much as possible. Now, even the road to Wake Robin is private, and so I was fortunate some years back, maybe about 8 or 9 years ago, the property was for sale that had the Wake Robin Lodge building. And so I got to see it from the outside and got to see it from the inside. And it's a very impressive structure, and it does take you back in time to the turn of the century. It's very pleasant, small elegance.
I have a question about the building of the Snark and why it didn't work out very well.
And why it didn't work?
Yeah, in other words, there were so many poor materials and it leaked and all of that. Is it because Jack London just left it to the people who were doing it and didn't supervise, or it seems like he was so interested in this voyage and in the building of the Snark, but also it didn't work out, and I'm a little bit puzzled by that.
The question has to do with what caused all the problems on the Snark during the construction. You recall the year that the construction started was the year of the earthquake. Jack London spent a lot of time trying to facilitate getting materials, but the shipyards had themselves, with necessities in terms of being able to continue any kind of work at all. And it took some time until they finally got started. Now, whenever there's a catastrophe, unfortunately, there are also people that take advantage of it, and consequently, if they would have been ordering certain parts from back east, those parts would have been, pretty high quality, which was being asked for. But in an emergency, they start getting parts from other places, and some of these other places are much closer, and they are the ones that can take advantage of the situation, and they can produce materials like the metal materials, where you have to hook ropes and stuff like that, and as soon as Jack London started pulling on a rope, the thing broke apart. So these things were partly the cause of the earthquake and the consequences of the earthquake. And also, we don't know how good the shipbuilders were that were working on Jack London's boat. We don't know how conscientious they were. We don't, in other words, if you look at a watertight compartment, it can look watertight and not be watertight. And, you know, the only way you can test it is to fill it up with water, you know, fully test it. So a lot of these things, we really don't know complete answers, unfortunately. It was the question had to do with Roscoe being let go as navigator and in Hawaii, and Jack London paying his way home so he could get out of the way. And Nanetta, Charmian's aunt, was supposed to be taking care of Jack's finances. She was taking care of it by using part of the finances that she shouldn't have been getting into. And so some of the bills that should have been paid had not been paid, and Jack London came back to straighten out the mess. He did, and he continued to let Nanetta do things with certain limits that he was able to place on her, and so she didn't have full control like she had before.
Wasn't she involved in the lawsuit about the creek?
Yes. There was, you know, not long before Jack died, the lawsuit on regarding Graham Creek, where Nanetta and other of her neighbors sued Jack London. So she was part of that. And, you know, prior to that, during the Snark voyage, you sort of have to remember Jack London's nature. It's basically a very trusting nature. And this was Nanetta, this was Charmian's aunt, and this was somebody who was close to Jack now, and he wanted to believe that she was a good person too. So they continued to have a reasonable relationship, and all the way to the end to where she sued him. Question over here.
Well, now, Eliza Shepherd, the stepsister of Jack, she also at some point managed his affairs while he was gone. Was she in the picture then? When they took off in the Snark, was she in the picture then? Is that correct?
No, this was before. She didn't come up to Glen Ellen until 1910.
Oh, okay, it was after. Okay.
Afterwards, right. The question had to do with when Jack London's stepsister came up to the ranch. Had it had anything to do with the Snark? No, there was no relationship.
I'd like to put in a plug for Martin Johnson, who was on that trip up the Snark. He came, of course, the most important thing was that he came from Kansas, and I came from Kansas. He said the captain gave a special commendation to him. And then he and his wife, Osa, I think they went traveling and moved all kinds of adventure stories about exploration elsewhere. I'm not sure just where, but anyway, he was quite famous later on after the voyage of the Snark.
Yeah, the question had to do with Martin Johnson, one of the crew members, and the fame that he achieved after the Snark voyage. He and his wife Osa did go all different places in the world, very wild places. Yeah, the question had to do with Martin Johnson, one of the crew members, and the fame that he achieved after the Snark voyage. He and his wife Osa did go all different places in the world, very wild places, to make documentaries that were shown first in silent and later on talking documentaries that were shown all the way to just prior to World War II. So they did a lot of films, and they chose places like places in Africa that were extremely wild, and Borneo and some of the other islands in the Pacific. So they kept the adventure going, and it just showed that Jack London had made the right decision in choosing Martin Johnson to be his cook.
Maybe you should mention that Martin Johnson did finish the trip and did go around the world.
Yeah, Martin Johnson, as you say, did finish the trip of going around the world, and of course had to rely on ships other than the Snark. Jack London, of course, he used Jack London's money to finance his trip. Jack was only too willing to do that. Back?
Yeah, you mentioned that McKeon left a year and a half before Jack died. What were the circumstances? Why did he leave?
Oh,
And what brought it about?
the question has to do with why did Nakata leave Jack London? It was about a year and a half before Jack died, and the reason he left was to go to dental school in San Francisco, to get married, and to move back to Oahu. So that's what he did. The question has to do with Jack's daughters. Did they ever go on the Roamer with him? No.
After Jack's death, did Charmian continue to sail?
Only insofar as taking steamers to Europe. In other words, trips. Not in the way she had sailed with Jack, no. Unless she was with a person that owned a sailboat. In other words, she was not seeking it out.
Ever involved, I mean, she lived a long time after Jack's death. Was she ever involved with you, as far as you know, with romantically with somebody else?
You talking about Charmian? Well,
The question is about Charmian's romances, possibly after Jack died, and the answer is that she had a very sexual part to her that remained active.
I had heard a rumor that she was involved with Houdini, but then he disappeared a lot.
Well, you're right, and it was more than a rumor. So, with Harry Houdini, she did get together with him.
But he was married.
Yes. Yes, he was married at the time. And yes, she did play around with Harry Houdini. And after a short time, she couldn't stand being around him, so she made him disappear.
People are very interested in whether Jack had grandchildren that had grandchildren, if there's any descendant of him.
Jack's descendants are many, and some of them are as close as Santa Rosa. Those are from Jack's daughter Joan. There are more descendants from Joan than there were from Becky, even though Joan only had one son. I did if you still have the Jack London booklet that I put together that you got at the training, I think I have the family trees in there. I put in a family tree for Joan, one for Becky, and one for the Shepherd family from Eliza. But yes, they are all around.
Yeah, so then the question was, are they living? So
The older ones, in other words, the children are pretty well gone, but the grandchildren are still around. Not all of them, but most of them.
Wasn't that Tarnell that did that little presentation?
Mhm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Tarnell is a descendant of Joan. Becky's descendants are further away, as far as maybe San Diego and other states. Anything else?
Did Becky have one child? Becky?
Well, actually, more than one. Becky had one child out of wedlock, actually. Okay, now we've gotten a long ways off from sailing. Jack London had so many adventures and went into areas that hardly anybody would want to go into. And that's why I find it very curious about Teddy Roosevelt's comment about Jack London being a nature faker, which he did publicly say. And Jack London did answer him, by the way. But I consider Jack London a true adventurer. And in regard to the types of adventures that he had, maybe at a level higher than Teddy Roosevelt. Back.
Talk about the winds to Marquesas from Hawaii, the trade winds. Are those because they're coming in a direction where he's like going right into them? Or, I mean, there was something in the books about nobody ever made it from Hawaii to the Marquesas, and for some reason Jack never got that message.
Well, he got it while he was on the way, because he read it in a book, that it was an impossible traverse to go from Hawaii down to the Marquesa Islands because it was a straight line south. Yeah. So Jack just figured out how to do it. And he was very fortunate because there were times that were pretty scary, like for instance where they were running out of water and were saved with the rain that came. So there were a lot of chances that they took, and they were lucky to make it through.
You said the first person who made this trip was in
98.
1898, so that was the first person on a, what you say, a small boat to make the trip from Hawaii to Marquesas or around the world?
Around the world.
Around the world.
No, it was Slocum made the trip around the world, and he sailed solo.
Okay.
So that was quite a feat.
I asked about his war correspondent work in Russian-Japanese war. And I'm asking in which side he was. In the Russian side or Japanese side? His sympathies.
Did he side with the Russians or the Japanese?
As a war correspondent, when he wrote about the war, he wrote about the magnificent preparation and maneuvers done by the Japanese that pretty well outsmarted the Russians in battle. He also wrote about the fear that the Japanese would use this war to rise up and become stronger as a world power. And so he did not necessarily take sides. He tried to report as he saw things that happened. So he did not take sides with the Russians or take sides with the Japanese. And he did say something after he came back And that was that Japan was destined to be a world power, but he also said that after that, China would become the biggest world power and from the East and take over from Japan.
I guess the china downstairs was given to them by Robert Louis Stevenson's wife, correct? The china downstairs in
The China?
yeah, isn't that Stevenson's china?
Well, that's what I'm not clear on. You see, I've heard conflicting information. One is that it did belong to the Stevensons. The other is that it belonged to the owner of the place and had been used by the Stevensons. So I don't know for sure.
I know on that field trip over to the museum, the Stevenson Museum, that they explained to us what a hero that Robert Louis Stevenson was to them. That he was a hero to them.
Yeah. Yeah, he was one of a few of the writers that Jack really looked up to. And of course, the other one in that area, the South Pacific, was Herman Melville. Okay. Are we ready to call it quits? Okay.